What prompted him to choose this subject, write this particular book? Patrick, can you hear me?
Yep. So you do you want to answer that now, Charlie?
Yes, we're recording now and we're live.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the impetus for writing this book is really like you, Charlie. I've had a long relationship with Paris. I've lived there off and on for many years. Like you, I'm a journalist by trade turned book writer, mainly historian, mainly military historian. And I was living in Paris at the time I got the idea, which was about 10 years ago now, with my family. And it struck me that even though I'd spent many years in the city on and off, I didn't actually know much about how it was liberated. You get lots of reminders in Paris of the event because there are, everywhere you look around the city, no doubt lots of you will know Paris quite well. You notice these little plaques, these little marble plaques set in the wall that say, ici tombe X, some man or woman who was shot down in the days of the liberation, that is, the days after August, mid-August 1944. And often it says by the Germans, sometimes it says by the Nazis. So you've got these sort of visible they're kind of ghostly presences, if you like, of the actual event. Plus here and there you see bullet holes in the wall that have been left there specifically as reminders of what happened. And so that led me to down the path of trying to explore who these people were, what actually happened. Like everyone knows the basics of the liberation story, but like all historians, I want to know whether the received version of events is actually what happened. I mean, history is being rewritten the whole time. The process of historiography is, to me anyway, as interesting as history itself, because history is, of course, always seen through the prism of those doing the writing and of the social and political conditions that they're writing in. So I think this question of resistance, which we're going to focus on today, is very much a case in point. There's resistance and resistance and resistance. It's a word that covers an enormous amount of attitudes and behavior. Yeah, and the story is about the liberation. It's not specifically about the resistance. Of course, resistance is a huge part of it. But the actual drama of the liberation itself is a terrific story. And again, as a journalist and book writer, that's a very attractive proposition.
What resistance was there in Paris before the events of the summer of 1944?
Well, it mirrored what the situation was in France. So I think you can tell the story of the French resistance in a fairly simple way. I think you could say at the outset, in 1940, after the catastrophic collapse of France, its really dismal military performance in the Battle of France, and then the abject way in which Paris was handed over to the Germans without a fight, meant that spirits were very, very low. So the actual impulse to resist was pretty much crushed. And of course, you weren't getting any interior or internal encouragement to resist because the Vichy government had surrendered shamefully and ignominiously to the Nazis, and it basically issued instructions to the French people: just do what you're told, do what the Germans tell you to do. And Vichy's role in all this was basically to just support most of the big German initiatives, all of which were extremely painful for France, and to run its own little mini fascist state down south initially. So yeah, you had to be pretty tough to decide to make the decision to resist in, say, the summer of the autumn of 1940. So I think in terms of numbers, you're really talking about hundreds or maybe 1,000, a little over 1,000 people who've actually made that decision. Some people have voted with their feet. They've gone off to Britain to join de Gaulle, who set up his standard in London as the completely unknown personality at the time. He had no standing politically or not much militarily. But this quixotic figure, had decided that he was the incarnation of Free France, and some people, a notable group of people, gathered around him. But inside France, nothing. I mean, nothing really happened until the huge political event of the Germans turning on their erstwhile Soviet allies meant that the French Communist Party, which up until then had been basically towing the party line from Moscow and saying that the Germans are, if not our friends, they're not our enemies. And so you had this huge, very powerful Communist Party which had been lying low. And then after Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, when the Hitler-Stalin Pact collapses and Russia and Germany are at war, the Communist Party then is thrown into the fray, and it forms the backbone of the resistance really throughout from then on. So it's by no means a totally communist organization. There are lots of resistance right across the political spectrum, from the far right to the communists. And they were forged into a sort of unified bloc in 1942. So basically the numbers involved in the resistance grow as the fortunes of the Germans decline. So you get ideological resistance like the communists, and indeed the people on the far right, often they're very Catholic, very nationalistic. You get opportunistic resistance, people who see the way the wind is blowing. This, of course, becomes increasingly the case as the war progresses, and decide it's time to choose a side, and that probably the resistance is the one to be on. And you get people who join out of desperation as well, when the Germans start deporting literally hundreds of thousands of young men to work as forced labor in German war factories and industries and farms. And they take to the hills, the Maquis, it was called, the kind of rough uplands, in order to escape being sent off to Germany and to take up arms against the Germans.
Now, I know all of you have a lot of questions because you've read Patrick's work. So who would like to ask the first question? If you don't put your hand up, I will choose one of you. Go ahead.
I can.
Stand up and give your name.
Yes. Yes. My name is Safwan Bakr Ananza. I'm a media student from Jordan. And me, honestly, I've never had a chance to speak with a historian. So I would thank you, Mr. Charles. So my first question goes, well, how do a lot of people criticize historians for romanticizing resistance? So I would say, how do you balance between having admiration for such a courage act, at the same time being as objective as you can in your writings?
Sorry, I missed the first part of the question. You're saying that people have...
A lot of people criticize historians and journalists for romanticizing resistance in their writing.
Romanticizing.
Yeah. So how do you balance?
Well, I'd be interested in what you think before I answer. Actually, I mean, do you think that, have you read stuff that you feel romanticizes resistance, and do you share that view that
I mean, with the part that comes to Madeleine risking everything she can have, everything she has for the resistance, I would see this as romanticizing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm very interested to hear that. Yeah, I mean, it can often be the case that some of the leading resistance were hugely egotistical, and you have to question their motives, whether they were basically interested in the business of self-glorification. I think the question of how you resist, it's one we must all ask ourselves. If we found ourselves in a situation that most French people did in the summer of 1940, where you obviously don't like your country being invaded, you don't probably have much sympathy with German ideology as it was, but what do you do about it? I mean, if you've got any dependents, if you've got any loved ones, if you're a parent, or even if you're a child of parents who might suffer as a result of your activities, you have to think very long, very hard. So you are balancing your own, the well-being of your loved ones against your desire for action and for revenge. And of course, people dealt with it in different ways. I was talking about the Communist Party. If you're in the Communist Party, communism was very akin to a religion. It had many of the aspects of religion. It required on faith and on obedience and on sacrifice. So I think it was easier if you were a communist because you would just follow orders and whatever suffering that was entailed by yourself or by those around you would just be offered up for the greater good. So that was one way of dealing with it. I think other people just thought, okay, I've only got one life and I'm prepared to give that up. And that view was shared by those immediately around them. I'm thinking in particular of a very right-wing, very early resistant called Gilbert Renault, who was a ultra-Catholic, who was actually in the film business. Doesn't sound like the sort of place you'd expect to write a very nationalist ultra-Catholic. But anyway, he just said, okay, you'd expect him actually, interesting, you would expect him to see a lot that he would like in the Vichy government. But he didn't. He just said, Pétain is a dreadful man, I'm going to give everything up. And he told his sisters that he was going off to France, going off from France to join up with de Gaulle in London. And they said, his two sisters said, okay, we're in as well. He told his parents. They said, okay, we're in as well. They knew perfectly well what the Germans were capable of. So there were people who were genuinely, nobly self-sacrificing. So I don't think you can romanticize their decisions too much. I think they're doing something. There are heroes in the world. And I think when you identify a real one, you ought to celebrate him or her. You mentioned Madeleine Riffaut. I think she came from a kind of staunchly patriotic family, and I think the story starts with her grandfather, who she admires enormously, and she thinks, I'm doing this, but I'm sure my grandfather, who by then was dead, would approve of what I'm doing. So I can see why you might think that there has been a tendency to perhaps spend too much time looking at the exploits and not enough of resistance and not enough on the actual consequences for those around them, and about examining that tricky question of how much of it is driven by ego.
I think each side of the redemption process. When you lean forward, we lose sight of you, so you have to lean back a little bit.
Me, yeah. So my kind of.
So who has the next question? Please stand up and.
Hello, my name is Ramis Kanj, and I'm a senior computer science student. So you just mentioned earlier that, in the resistance, there were many right-wingers as well as communists that were both in the resistance. And I wanted to ask you, do you think this happens often in many other cases other than what happened in France, or is it unique to France? And the second question is, what's the dynamic have you heard any stories of interactions? And I'm interested in the dynamic of a resistance where you have those completely different political sides, which usually, are against each other and hate each other, how they can, function together.
Yeah, that's a very interesting aspect of the story. And what you have to bear in mind if we're talking about France is that France was a very fractured society prior to the war. So there was very little national cohesion, and the political rivalries were very vicious. The language they used towards each other was very violent. And from time to time, there was actually violence between the two, mercifully not a lot. But so there was no kind of political, very little shared political common ground between the political ideologies that were active in France at the start of the war. So it took time for them to come together. I just want to deal with that first question you mentioned before I move on to talk a bit more about France. About can I think of other resistance movements that were where they worked across the political spectrum? Well, I think you can say actually virtually all the resistance movements in occupied Europe were. So the Dutch resistance, the Norwegian resistance, the Danish resistance. They were not. They did actually make common cause. And thinking of an example today, I mean, just looking at Ukraine, you've got very kind of moderate, middle of the road people doing the fighting. You've also got very right wing people doing the fighting. I'm thinking of the Azov Corps, as it is now. It's not obviously Azov Brigade, which were, they were, let's face it, pretty close to being neo-Nazis at the beginning of the conflict back in 2014. I'm talking about. They've now shed their ideological far right trappings and are pretty much mainstream, although there may be a few wrong ones in there. But to get back to France, yeah, I mean the bringing together of those very disparate groups was a terrific achievement, which was largely the work of one man, Jean Moulin, who was himself a left, very successful public servant. He was on the left, but he wasn't a communist. He went to Britain and was given the order by de Gaulle to go back and unite all these disparate political elements, which he did very successfully, moving clandestinely around the country, holding secret meetings, and eventually they all came together in Paris in 1942, where the trade union movement, the communists, all representatives right across the political spectrum, all decided to come together in this National Council of Resistance, which worked pretty effectively, actually, right up until the end. So I think what helps people to set aside their political differences and not to have the arguments about what kind of country they're going to forge when it is all over is due really to personal example and to, if you're in the resistance together and you're showing the same dangers, the same outcomes will descend on you. If you're caught, you will be tortured, you will be put to death. Then I think that is quite a powerful incentive to set aside your differences and to put off the arguments until a later date and just get on with the work in hand. And the work in hand often is really just a question of staying alive, staying together, staying organized, and just being present, just existing. There's a brilliant movie which I would urge you to see. You've got to get it on YouTube, called The Army of the Shadows by a brilliant French director, Jean-Pierre Melville, which makes this point, it's just about the day-to-day life of resistance. It's really just about surviving. There is a climax when they do actually pull off a successful operation, bring some of their comrades from prison. But by and large, it's just not getting caught. It takes up an enormous amount of energy, staying in contact, trying to gather a bit of information about what's going on, making yourself useful in some way. It's a very labor-intensive business, but not very much obvious reward.
Stand up.
Yeah. I'm Melinda Naume. I'm a media student. My question was actually about Jean Moulin, because the story I had always heard about him was so hardcore. It kind of stuck in my mind. It was that he was sent to bring everyone together, and then the Germans captured him, and they kind of didn't know who. They knew that they had someone good, but they didn't know that they had if they'd gone in to talk, the resistance would have been over because he knew everybody. And so the way I always heard the story was they tortured him for one day, and he was like, "Oh, I'm not going to last another." So he bashed his head into the wall of his cell until he killed himself. And I was wondering if that was an urban legend that I heard, or if it's no one was there, so they don't really know what happened. Because I read that he was tortured to death, but also it doesn't seem like he gave up information either. So
Yeah. I'm not actually a great expert on Jean Moulin. I recall he died on a train. I'm just checking actually. After being betrayed, I think it's pretty clear that he was. It was a fellow. Yeah, he died on a train while in. He was tortured, and his death was registered at Metz railway station. But it
oh, on a
doesn't.
train.
Yeah, well, that's what I remember. I'm just double checking.
So did they kill him accidentally then?
No, I think he was. Yeah, I think he was tortured to death, but not. I don't think he was tortured to death. I think he died under torture. If you see what I mean, there's a sort
Oh,
of
okay.
difference. Yeah. But yeah, no, it's just he was. He attempted suicide. Oh no, that was when he was first captured in 1940. There's a long story, a very interesting story about how he refused to sign a bit of paper when he was the prefect of a department in Western France. But the Germans killed a load of black soldiers, and they tried to get him to sign a piece of paper saying that they had been killed by the British in a bombing raid or something, and he refused to sign it. And then they tortured him, and he tried to commit suicide. Anyway, I'm getting away from the Okay, I'm just getting to your thing. Yeah, so he was tortured by Klaus Barbie, who was a very notorious Gestapo chief of Lyon, I believe. Yeah, there was some uncertainty around the exact circumstances of Moulin's death, including about the view that he died while being transported by train to Germany. But all we know is that he was on a train to Germany, being severely tortured, and his death was registered. He died on the train, so his death was registered at Metz station, which is just on the border with Germany. So yeah, but it's even to this day the circumstances of his betrayal are disputed. But it seems that it was one of his own who actually gave him away.
Next question.
My name is Leah Nuruddin. I'm a senior psychology major. And my question is that you write, popular sympathy for communist gunmen was initially very limited. Why was the early resistance so mistrusted by ordinary Parisians? And what, in your opinion, is the tipping point that shifted that opinion?
Well, I think it was a. If we were talking specifically about Paris, Paris, there is red Paris. There was a red areas of Paris which were always communist voting, but it's largely a bourgeois city, and I think even when the French resistance was really moving onto the offensive, and it was clear the war was over for the Germans were going to leave sometime, there was very mixed feelings among the prosperous sections of the Paris population, where they were thinking, well, okay, we've got rid of the Germans. What happens next? Are the communists going to come for us, dispossess us, throw us out of our 16th arrondissement departments, etc., etc. So, yeah, I think certainly the record of the communists in the war as being the only ones that stood up to the Germans was certainly did them a lot of good electorally, nationally, when the first elections were held after the liberation. But it wasn't that long before that the Communist Party had been essentially supporting the German occupation. I mean, astonishingly, as soon as the Germans took over, well, not astonishingly, quite logically, really, the communist leaders went to the German occupiers and said, "Okay, we're now brothers in arms. Essentially, we've both occupied Poland together. Hitler and Stalin are in an alliance. Can we now operate openly as a communist party? Can we start republishing our newspaper, L'Humanité, which had been banned under the previous legitimate French government because of its subversive line, and were told, no, you can't. But but that didn't actually lead them onto the offensive with the Germans. They tried to fraternize with them, and there was an underground version of the newspaper, and that one of the editorials I quoted in the book, I think, said, "Comrades, when you go into your local bar and you see a German soldier, clap him on the shoulder, buy him a drink. He's a proletarian like you, you know." So that was the tone. You know? So, that had only been a few short years before. So I think there was a considerable amount of mistrust, quite understandably, towards the communists. And the other thing they didn't know was what the orders were from Moscow, because this was still the era of the possibility, at least, of worldwide revolution, where Moscow might decide, okay, well, you know, we'll now use the Communist Party as a Trojan horse to overthrow democracy and establish a communist state there, which would be, of course, in our orbit. That's certainly what they were doing in Italy. So no one knew what was going to come next. So I think you'd have to be pretty naive to assume that because the communists had had a good war, at least from June 1941 onwards, that they were going to carry on behaving themselves.
Thank you for your time.
Yes. Hello, my name is Shadan and I'm a political science student. Shadan Ken. The affiche rouge was intended as Nazi propaganda, but became a resistance icon. How do moments like these complicate the study of historical movements, historical memory?
So what was the name you mentioned? The first name?
Affiche rouge. My name?
Yeah,
No,
the name of the resistant who became an icon.
I'm talking about the affiche rouge that was intended to be as, yes,
Post.
written as affiche rouge. When I was searching about it afterwards. Yes. It was used as Nazi propaganda and then as a resistance icon. Red sign.
That's not his fault. We're trying to confine the questions to the book.
No, it's in the book.
It's in the book.
Yeah, it was what's it called? They plastered Paris with copies of a red inked poster
Oh,
illustrated
yeah,
with
yeah. Well,
mugshots.
the Manoukian, Misak Manoukian. You're talking about Misak Manoukian,
Yes, I was.
the Armenian poet, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, that's
How
right.
do you- Like, does that complicate the study of historical memory?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. No, it's a good question. For anyone who doesn't recall this incident, Misak Manoukian was an Armenian. His parents were killed in the Turkish genocide. So he was brought up indeed in Beirut, and then moved to France when he was 16 or 17. He worked as a metal worker, which was very much a hotbed of communism, the metal factories. He was a very distinguished Armenian poet and published literary magazines in Armenian while he was in Paris, which circulated in the Armenian community, exile community. He was also a communist, and so when the communist resistance began to organize, he became head of the overseas communist department, if you like, or cells, which was called the main d'oeuvre immigré, so foreign laborers, immigrant laborers, a lot of whom were Jewish. And he and his men and women were actually among probably the most active in terms of assassinating senior Nazi officials, carrying out sabotages. They were, they really did terrorize the Germans in Paris for a period at the end of 1943. However, as you rightly identify, when the history of the resistance came to be written, which was pretty much immediately the war was over, these guys were a bit of an embarrassment because none of them were French. They were Polish Jews, Armenians, etc., etc., and they'd done a lot more damage to the Germans than the homegrown communists had. You better just mention that Manoukian and his comrades were captured again, betrayed by a fellow resistant. A very banal circumstance. It was one of their associates who was annoyed that his girlfriend had gone off with one of the Manoukian group. Anyway, they were all captured. They were put on a show trial in Paris and then executed 2 days later. They became famous because the Germans put up a poster, kind of red poster, the Affiche Rouge, which tried to make the point that saying the headline was, "Freedom fighters know they're terrorists. They are members of the army of crime." But it backfired because the pictures, look it up on the internet. It's an incredibly powerful poster. You see these faces of these raggedy dressed, long-haired young men and a couple of women staring defiantly at the camera, knowing that in a few days they're going to be killed. And it's just incredibly moving and powerful. And that was the effect that it had on people who saw the poster. Even bourgeois Parisians looked at these renegades and thought, God, I wish I had the guts to be like them. So it had a contrary effect. Anyway, to get back to your question, so after the war, of course, the dead hand of the Communist Party historians descended on the story, and it was presented as a triumph after triumph by this committee and that committee and this favoured leader. And the actual story of the Manoukian group was very much pushed to one side. And thank heavens, the story has been redressed now, because 2 years ago, Manoukian, long is dead, his body and his remains and all those of his comrades long disappeared after being shot in Mount Valérien, fort just outside Paris, were symbolically interred in the Pantheon in Paris, where all great men and latterly women of France are buried, or supposedly buried. And that was actually an initiative by Emmanuel Macron, who is much derided in France. I personally am a Macron fan. But that was his initiative. He turned up at the ceremony. I was meant to go, and unfortunately I was unwell. But I watched it live, and it was terrific. It was just an amazing tribute and an act of historical justice.
We're going to see that there's a film about crime, which we're going to see next week. Not being able to see it by Robert.
Oh.
We're going to one of the films we understand. So it's good. Someone who hasn't asked, please.
Hi, my name is Lain Mahmoud. I'm a senior media student. So my question is, the story involves a mix of resistance fighters, the ordinary Paris people, and the allies, and even the German officers. Which group's perspective was the hardest to capture accurately?
Sorry, which group was the hardest to?
To capture accurately.
Oh, I see. Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, they all present their challenges. Well, I suppose, in a way, the most interesting is the German leadership, particularly von Choltitz, the governor of Paris, who only arrived a couple of weeks before the actual liberation. Because as a psychological study, he's a fascinating character. He's, at the beginning of the war, he's a sort of absolute classic Russian militarist, whose family have been serving various princes generation after generation. He's got a full set of conservative nationalistic German views, and he's a very enthusiastic Nazi at the beginning of the war. Not a kind of party. He hasn't got party membership or anything like that, but he thinks Hitler's a pretty good guy, and he takes part in the early campaigns in the Battle of France. He's involved in the fighting in the Low Countries. Then he goes off to the Eastern Front, where his unit and him are directly involved in atrocities, particularly actually in Crimea. And then he goes off to Normandy, and but he's alongside his devotion to Hitler, he's also a human being and a survivalist. And so, as the war progresses, and particularly by the spring of 1944, he knows the game is up, and so he's now playing a very tricky game of trying not to arouse any suspicion from the Gestapo and the Nazi security services, because, of course, by July 1944, there's been the plot by the army against Hitler, which unfortunately fails, or fortunately it fails, depending on your point of view. So he gets given the gig to go and be the new military governor of Paris. The old one has been removed because he was part of the plot. And so he describes brilliantly in his memoirs going to visit Hitler at the Wolf's Lair in Rastenburg in East Prussia. And there's page after page of description of this man who's clearly lost it. And so whatever a residual respect he had for Hitler has gone, and he just sees this frothing madman standing in front of him, issuing him with these crazy orders to go and defend Paris to the last man. And so off he goes. So he set the scene for his own sort of moral dilemma, or rather his own sort of personal dilemma, about how do I do the least possible to carry out my orders without incurring the wrath of the Gestapo in Berlin, but at the same time not doing so much that I then end up dangling on the end of a noose when the Allies eventually arrive, as they inevitably will in Paris, and I'm arraigned on war crimes and sentenced to death. So that was a real, that was a fascinating sort of scenario that you had to examine and to try and get into Choltit's head and see why he did this and why he did that. He wrote, of course, like they all did, a tremendously sort of exculpatory account of all this after the war, in which he presents himself in the best possible light, who's simultaneously a patriot, a humanitarian, a decent soldier, and a friend of mankind generally. It's a great feat of intellectual nimbleness that he manages to pull off. So yeah, I think for me that was probably the one I got most satisfaction from trying to decipher.
To destroy Paris by Hitler? Paris burning.
Speak a bit louder.
I think it was von Choltitz ordered to destroy Paris, its major monuments, before the Germans left.
Well, that's what he says. Yeah, I mean, there was this Trümmelfeld, the field of ruins, which is what Hitler said Choltitz should reduce Paris to if it became clear that he couldn't hold it. But he said that on several occasions. So everyone, or maybe some of you will remember the movie and the book Is Paris Burning? Brent Paris. And Choltitz maintained that there was a phone call to him in which Hitler barked, is Paris burning? But there's no evidence of this at all. And one of von Choltitz's claims for himself was that he defied this order. But the fact of the matter is, it's been pretty conclusively shown, not least by me in the book, that there was no way that he had the wherewithal to actually blow up Paris if he had wanted to carry out the order. So, I mean, it's slightly complicated, but the charges were certainly placed in some of the key monuments, some of the big buildings. But Paris was in chaos. To carry out a big demolition operation like that, you would need conditions of calm and security, which just simply didn't exist.
I'd like questions from those who haven't asked yet, please.
Hi, my name is Mana. I'm a sophomore. My name is Mana Mukullid. I'm a sophomore pre-med student, and I wanted to ask, how should we understand the legacy of Paris liberation today in France and beyond France?
Well, I think I'll stick to France because I can't really think of how it could be, the lesson could be applied in another historical circumstance. But I think one massive lesson, I think probably the big lesson about the French liberation is that if you control the story, you control events thereafter. And that the story, any of you who are historian, who are studying history, who are studying literature, who are studying anything in communication really, should really take note of this, which is that if you get your version out first of what's actually happened, then you are in a terrifically powerful political position. And this is exactly what Charles de Gaulle did. So when he arrives in Paris on the evening of August the 25th, and it goes to the town hall, the Paris town hall, the Hotel de Ville, and makes his first speech. People had never seen de Gaulle before. He's never, if you lived in France, you could listen to him secretly on the BBC radio, but you didn't know what he looked like. And so, you know, he's this complete man arriving from Mars, if you like, this very tall, very striking looking, but weird looking guy. He was a very strange looking man. He tremendously tall with quite a small head. Anyway, so this is his moment. He has to make his mark in this speech, and he does it brilliantly. Again, you can see this on YouTube. It's a terrifically powerful piece of film. And so he sets out his version of events, and he says, Paris has been humiliated, Paris has been shamed, Paris has been this, Paris has been that. But Paris has now been liberated by itself, liberated by the forces of France, etc., which is a complete lie. Paris has not been liberated by itself. It's been liberated by the invading armies of Britain, America first and foremost, Canada, Poland. The Free French Division did not arrive until 6 weeks after D-Day. So this is an utter fantasy. He also suggests that there's also been a national uprising, and that this has also contributed massively to the liberation. And finally, of course, the idea that the resistance were militarily strong enough themselves to oust the Germans is another fiction. So, but that was the version that the French needed to hear. Everyone knew that it wasn't actually true. But at that moment, if he'd started telling the truth, the very, very, very fragile unity of the moment would have been shattered, and there could have been very significant subsequent consequences which would have made bringing France together, trying to make some sense or atonement for the shame of the occupation. All this would have been immeasurably more difficult. So I think that basically the circumstances of the liberation matter less than the narrative that is constructed thereafter.
Has not asked. Probably good was the second question, but I want to get everyone to get a first question.
I wanted to thank you for being here with us today. I'm Mia Abdelaziz. I'm a junior psychology student, and I wanted to mention that in your book, you talk about the Alphonses and their role in the successful liberation of Paris. So my question is, to what extent do you believe that the liberation relied on mobilizing these passive masses rather than just on the act of small fighting groups?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, it is very much the case that there was a sort of popular uprising, which didn't necessarily take the form of, you know, going and shooting a German, but just getting out in the streets. And of course, that's very much symbolized by barricades. Barricades are very much part of the kind of folk history of the Parisian street, of the Parisian mob, you would say, I suppose, if you were a reactionary, and of the people in arms, if you were on the left. So yeah, so you get all over, not in posh Paris, but in ordinary Paris, you get these barricades springing up 2 or 3 days into the uprising, which make life difficult for the Germans because they can't get from A to B without having to maneuver all around these side streets and all the rest of it. So they're doing their bit, actually doing a practical job. And at the same time, they're symbolizing the hatred of the occupation, which has been simmering away but hasn't really had an opportunity to manifest itself until now. And yeah, this is very much part also of it allows de Gaulle, as I was saying earlier, to say that there was a kind of mass movement involved. It is very temporary, and it is, as we would now say, rather performative, but nonetheless, it has its value, and it does show another interesting aspect of it is that the Germans managed to kid themselves. The occupiers managed to kid themselves for a long time. They were actually, if not exactly welcome, they weren't hated, and that people seemed to get along with them. When they went to a restaurant or a bar, the waiters were perfectly polite to them. When they went to a nightclub, there were plenty of women there that were happy to go off and sleep with them. So they kind of kidded themselves that actually, do you know what? We're not that unpopular. They're just people like us. They can see the good side of us. And this showed them definitively that wasn't the case. Beneath this veneer of, necessary politeness, or at least absence of overt hostility, there was this simmering hatred.
Ali, what about you? You usually got some good questions. What about it?
Can't really think of much right now, to be honest.
Read it? Did you read the passages?
Yeah, but I was gonna ask about someone that I was gonna ask earlier about German guy was given orders to destroy Paris. I was gonna ask if he would rather if the reason why he didn't go ahead.
Apparently he didn't get the order anyway. He didn't get that order anyway.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
So that was your only question.
Yeah, that was the main question.
You have a question?
Yes, I had a question.
You stand up and give your full name and year.
Yes. Hello, my name is Fadl Mansour. I'm a senior CS student. I was going to ask you, towards the end of the resistance and the liberation, the French people started like executing the collaborators and stuff like that. But if you take an example here in Lebanon in 2000, when the South Lebanon army dismissed, the collaborators were just imprisoned and stuff. So what is your view on that?
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know what happened to the South Lebanon army, and it's quite encouraging to hear that there wasn't a kind of purging. There wasn't sort of summary justice. There weren't kind of executions, extrajudicial killings of people who collaborated with the Israelis. But yeah, you're absolutely right. There was this what they call the épuration sauvage, the savage cleansing, which took place immediately, even before the liberation was complete. They were some elements of the communists, it has to be said, rounding up people they suspected of collaborators. Often they got it wrong. There were many, many cases of mistaken identity, or just a kind of mob hysteria where someone points to someone and says, "Oh, she slept with a German," or she was giving away secrets to the Germans, and they're all just rounded up, taken to this the Eastman Clinic, which was a very modern dental facility on the left bank, which was actually the headquarters of one of the great heroes of the resistance, Pierre Georges, better known as Colonel Fabien. There's a metro station named after him. If you get a pass, you'll no doubt notice it. Anyway, his deputy was leading this sort of roundups, the people they captured were tortured, they were executed, they were robbed as well. They were executed. Many of them were, had their hands tied behind their backs and thrown into the Seine, where their bodies kind of floated downriver for several weeks. Now, this is an interesting aspect of the story, because in the kind of chaos that follows an event like the liberation of Paris, you get criminal elements who are often involved in the resistance themselves. That's another element of the story, is you get opportunists who join up because who see that, you know, the anarchy, or rather the illegitimate nature of what they're doing by being in the resistance also opens up opportunities for criminal activities, and there's plenty of that going on. And so Colonel Fabien's deputy was a kind of, you know, he was a communist, but he was also a well-known criminal, and he decided to take this opportunity to enrich himself and to carry out some score settling. And also, he didn't care particularly whether people were innocent or guilty. It was just a bad act. So yeah, a lot of score settling went on, not just in Paris, all over France. People who had old enmities, old scores to settle, or saw an advantage. I mean, if you're say you own a garage in Limoges, and you've actually kept your head down during the war, but your rival has actually done a lot of business with the Germans, and he's actually now, you know, considerably richer than you are. When liberation comes, it's a great opportunity to denounce him as a collaborator to the local resistance, have him put in front of a court for a hearing that will last about 5 minutes, and then taken outside and shot, and then you take over his business. So there's quite a lot of kind of the nasty side of human nature gets a field day in these circumstances.
I'm still going to try and close it about this.
Hello, Mr. Bishop. Thank you for being here with us. I wanted to ask. Oh, sorry. My name is Amin Kharat. I'm a media and communications senior. In what ways do you think occupations of developed countries differ from occupations of underdeveloped countries? Is there a notable distinction? And if so, in what ways do those factors shape the form and degree of oppression inflicted upon the occupied people?
Well, I think it's really much a question of sophistication. You know, the sophistication of a society, the more sophisticated the society is, the harder it's going to be to control, because there will be lots of organizations, lots of social networks, lots of professional networks, lots of economic networks, political parties, trade unions. You've got to suppress all these. You've got to make them dance to your tune. You've got to control them. That makes your life a lot more difficult. The way you go about it is, I can only speak about the Second World War with any authority, and that differs from country to country. If you're the Germans, and their way of dealing with things was, of course, very much shaped by their racist ideology. So in a country, if they go into Ukraine, as Soviet Ukraine, then they're just got to kill everyone left and right. Ditto with the Poles. So with Poland, they set about systematically trying to deal with anyone who's going to give them any trouble by imprisoning them and killing them. More so, actually, the Soviets. I have to say, the Soviets were the ones who went in from the other side with a list of the intelligentsia, anyone who could who was deemed to be a potential enemy of the communist project, and then just set about murdering them. So, but in the case of France, Germans saw the French as being, in many ways, culturally admirable. They saw them as being fellow Aryans. They saw them as being not Aryans in the sense of Nordic, blue eyes, blonde hair, but members of the civilized world. which they included themselves in, of course. And so they used much, even though there was the occupation could be very brutal, they tended, where possible, to get cooperation rather than use oppression. And in that case, as I said at the very beginning, they were helped enormously by having a government in Vichy who basically they used the word themselves, they collaborated. It was a collaborationist government. But I think in primitive societies, then it's much more a kind of colonial effort, isn't it? Where you just, anyone raises their hand against you, you kill them, and then eventually they get the message and buckle down.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Something for you. Lance?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Enjoyed it.